We haven't really talked about this in the committee this year, and many of us are new in the committee, so it will be, for some people, really starting from scratch, I think, in their understanding of what this is all about. Others of us might be very familiar, and then a wide, running the spectrum in between. If you would, I guess, like to introduce yourself, maybe, I don't know if it makes sense to introduce yourselves one at a time or just as you come to into the witness chair, but then we'll go around and introduce ourselves to you as well. So, but please, Jane, if you'd like to start.
Sure. Thank you very much for having us. Jane Lazarchuk. I'm the director of the newly formed Climate Action Office within the Agency of Natural Resources.
Hey, I'm David Durfee, and I'm the chair of the committee. I'm from Shaftesbury, down in Bennington County, District. Let's go around.
Sure. I'm vice chair of the committee, Heather Supernaut, and I'm in Windsor 4 representing Barnard, Pomfret, and Bridgewater.
I'm Esme Cole. I represent Windsor 6, which is Hartford.
I'm John O'Brien. I represent Royalton and Tunbridge.
Mike Rice, I represent the Bennington Rutland District, Dorset, Danby, Landgrove, Mount Tabor, and Peru.
I get that memorized any minute now. Josie Levitt, I'm Grandel Chittenden, which is all of Grandel County and a little bit of West Milton.
David Templeman, Orleans 3. That's Brownington, Barton, and Westmore.
Charles Wilson, I'm Caledonia 3, which is Lindenville, Sheffield, Wheelock, Sutton, and Newark.
Henry Pearl, I represent Danville, Cabot, and Beach.
Jed Lipsky, represent Lamoille 1, Stowe.
Rodney Graham, represent Orleans 3, which is Williamstown and Chelsea.
So I'm happy to have my colleagues introduce themselves now too, just so you understand.
Just so we know who's in the room. That's probably a good idea. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, folks, good afternoon. My name is Ryan Patch. I'm with the Vermont Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets. I am the Agriculture, Climate, and Land Use Policy Manager there.
Hi, I'm Billy Koster. I'm the Director of Planning and Policy for the Vermont Agency of Natural Resources.
And I guess we can finish up and then we'll go to Abby. Yep.
I have a temporary legislative position, more of a listening role than a speaking role.
Okay. We won't ask you to speak then. beyond that. Thank you very much. We also have, just so we completely covered the room, we've got our committee assistant, Laura Rich in the corner. I'm not sure you can see everyone, Abby, but that's everyone who's currently in the room. And if you would like to just introduce yourself too.
Sure. Hi, everybody. Abby Course. I'm the Farm and Forest Sector Representative to the Vermont Climate Council and a co-owner of the Course Farm Dairy down in Whitingham, Vermont. Thanks for having us.
Thank you for being here. So why don't you kick us off?
Sure. So thanks again for inviting us in, and hopefully throughout the testimony today, we'll dive deeper into sort of the details of the work that your committee's most interested in. As the director of the Climate Action Office, my job here today is to ground you in the Global Warming Solutions Act, the broader process of development of the Climate Council. And then what I'd like to do is just sort of pivot and talk about implementation over the last year and give you a varied high-level approach of all of the work with some more deeper dives into some of the areas around agriculture and forestry that I know you'll be more interested in, and other staff can build upon what I lead you off with today. And it was really wonderful to hear all the towns that you are from. I have had the privilege of working at the Agency of Natural Resources for 17 years now. Most of that career was out in the field working across the state for the Fish and Wildlife Department on land. So many of your towns have lovely pieces of state property in and around them. So it's really great to see so many represented here. So let me share. My apologies for not getting this to your assistant before today, but I'm glad you'll have it after. So again, Jane Lazarchuk, I work within the Secretary's office closely with Billy Koster as well as Secretary Moore. And the Agency of Natural Resources is the fiduciary arm and administrative hand of the Climate Council. The Global Warming Solutions Act was passed by the legislature in September of 2020. it was nothing short of quite ambitious to think about how we would meet the challenge of facing climate change in Vermont. In order to meet the objectives of the GWSA, there was an independent body set up to sort of advise and act in concert with state government and other parties to put forward the initial climate action plan and oversee other components of implementation in the GWSA. The Climate Council itself is comprised of 23 members, 8 administration officials representing secretaries and commissioners of agencies that have the biggest stake in climate action, and our Agency of Transportation, Agency of Human Services, as well as PSD and others. And then 15 legislatively appointed members, 8 from the House and 7 from the Senate that have terms. The Senate appointees were 3 years out of the gate, and the House appointees were 2 years intended to stagger reappointments and positions on the council. So our first appointees have been transitioning off this fall from the House, and we've been working with the Speaker to refill those seats. Those 15 seats that are legislatively appointed represent sectors such as farm and forestry, like Abby's, renewable energy, environmental community groups, fuel dealers, and others that really have a robust stake in the ideas and creation and process around moving climate action in the state. We were able to go deeper and work with more Vermonters in setting up the subcommittees. There were 4 subcommittees that were written into law: the Rural Resilience and Adaptation Subcommittee, the Ag and Ecosystems, Agriculture and Ecosystems Subcommittee, Cross-Sector Mitigation, and Just Transitions. Happy to answer questions about what they all were responsible for, but I know Billy will hopefully dive deeper into what Ag and Ecosystems specific scope of work was. But the council was also given the discretion to stand up any other subcommittees needed to do the work. And there was a 5th subcommittee, Science and Data, which of course was really the underpinning and review of all of the recommendations and work that went into the climate action plan. Those subcommittees brought in more than 60 additional Vermonters into the process, volunteers, I'll say, who really gave a tremendous amount of work, especially in the first year of standing up the climate action plan. We were really asking a lot on a short timeline. You'll see based on the timeline on the screen, the Global Warming Solutions Act was passed in September after a veto override by the governor, and that stalling from the spring of COVID to the fall lost quite a bit of time to actually move forward with the work. And that first plan was due just 13 months from the passage and standing up of the council. And what I like to say about the climate action plan that's different from other states is it's not only the what do we need to do, but it's the how, so the operational tasks. So other states have stood up climate action plans in similar timelines, but they have not included sort of the where we need to go, the what's next to be done. And so it was really an impressive undertaking that fell short in some places, and I will touch on those areas. And that's why we've called it initial plan, recognizing there's more work to do. And at the very least, we know we need to update the plan within 4 years and every 4 years after. In order to meet the challenges of implementation of the climate action plan and appreciating the role of state government, the Agency of Natural Resources worked with the administration and the legislature last year to put forward a recommendation that was in line with the climate action plan to stand up a climate action office to sort of be responsible for the intergovernmental coordination of climate action and thinking about the roles and responsibilities coming out of the climate action plan. ANR is certainly not the only agency responsible for meeting this challenge. We have really robust partnerships with the Ag Agency, obviously represented here with our work with Ryan Patch and others, Public Service Department, Agency of Transportation, but the rubber really meets the road with ANR with respect to how the Global Warming Solutions Act was written, in that the emissions reductions requirements that are put forward, which I'll touch on here today, are that we are responsible for tracking those through our greenhouse gas inventory, and citizens and others can bring suit to A&R and A&R only with respect to if we don't meet those emissions reductions requirement. So there was a good argument to be made that A&R was in the best position to serve that intergovernmental structure. We also have an appreciation, which I know this committee is invested in, around the work that we do around clean water and how we coordinate that and support that with other agencies and track progress there. And we know that that will be a really critical role in being able to communicate state progress on climate action and the climate action plan. And that will be foundational in the Climate Action Office, thinking about how we measure and track progress going forward. I also just want to say that the Climate Action Office is also in a unique position to build capacity now in our own office, but also in coordination with the Environmental Justice Unit being stood up in the Secretary's office in response to Act 154 last year. We appreciate and recognize that the public has a significant role in climate action to be successful in meeting the ambitious reduction requirements and all of the objectives in the Global Warming Solutions Act. We cannot be telling people what we need to do. We need to be thinking about how we co-create those solutions with them and bring them along to understand what a successful transition will look like for them. In order to sort of ensure that that intergovernmental cooperation is there and we're thinking about how we speak in one voice, we went a step further and proposed that we would set up an interagency advisory board to the Climate Action Office. I like to think now that we have like two climate councils, one of outside advising us on the work we need to do, and then one that really resonates with state government and really tries to programmatically move on climate action and speak in one voice about what the priorities are and the work of state government in the coming years. We've had 2 meetings. We've been working really closely to think about what a charter looks like and responsibilities of that group. It is staffed at the highest level from folks across the Public Service Department, Agency of Transportation, A&R, Vermont Emergency Management, the Agency of Ag and Farm Markets, Buildings and General Services, Department of Children and Family, who manage a lot of low-income weatherization programs, Vermont Department of Health, Agency of Commerce and Community Development, and close cooperation with our state climatologist, which is a position awarded to Dr. Leslie Ann Dupini-Giroux at UVM. And we work really closely with her to build capacity and think about how we respond to the scientific needs that drive policy and programs for climate action. So the Climate Action Plan was adopted on December 1st of 2021. With no time to spare, we were making edits the morning of the meeting with the Climate Council. It was really a work right up until the end kind of plan. I did mention that we weren't able to finish it all. There are outstanding components that we are still working on that I'll touch on that has seen tremendous progress over the last year. But it was really an unbelievable undertaking by really volunteers in support with state staff and working really closely. But it was really a collaborative effort with the members of the subcommittees where much of that technical and geographic expertise resided, and then coming up to the Climate Council where the recommendations were deliberated on and then acted on to be included in the plan. So what's in it? It aims to cut our pollution in line with essentially the Paris Climate Agreement and what the Biden administration has put forward, roughly cutting climate pollution in Vermont from all of our sectors in half by 2030. The specific reduction requirement in the GWSA is 40% below 1990 levels. But what the Paris Climate Agreement goes on and what Biden often speaks to is actually cutting in half from 2005 levels, which was actually our highest year for emissions. So cutting in half from there is actually quite similar to cutting 40% from 1990. It strives to prioritize those who are most affected first. The Just Transitions Committee put forward at the beginning of the process a set of guiding principles that was intended to be the roadmap for how we developed recommendations for the Climate Action Plan, as well as an equity impact assessment that looked at how we could measure and respond to how we are implementing these programs and creating them in an equitable way That is ongoing work. That is the work that is hard, that really requires us to have more detail and work with the public and be responsive. And it's something that we're trying to do on an ongoing basis. It was really shaped by those 5 subcommittees. Again, that is where the expertise really resided. And we were able to do as much public input as we could in a year of pandemic, in a year of people at home. We did have, we are guided by the public meeting law. All of our meetings are open. All the subcommittee meetings are open. We had robust public engagement with constituents who participated there. We also did we did 5 in-person and 2 online meetings to roll out the climate action plan and have input on that space and take input. And we are continually formulating a public engagement plan and process to continue to engage with Vermonters on specific aspects and implementation of the plan. Again, it should be updated at least every 4 years, but I'll speak to some components in the plan that weren't finished on time and are still a work in progress right now. And again, it really gets at not only the what, that's the pathways, we called it in the plan, but the operational tasks, the 234 actions across the board that we need to do to make measurable progress in this area. And finally, I'll just speak to the fact that we put forward a framework for how we were going to measure and track progress. And that is a big area that we are now moving forward with one-time funding that we were able to secure in our budget last year, and hope to secure additional resources in the coming budget to roll out a robust stakeholder process to think about data needs, data that's already collected in different spaces, and how we can assimilate that to tell a compelling story, not only about the progress we're making to cut emissions, but also how are we measuring and tracking progress to build resilience and adaptation in our natural and working lands, in our communities, and then how are we measuring and tracking equitable implementation? So how many people are engaging with us? What are they range and spectrums? Where do they live? So I want to sort of shift and illuminate for you as best I can where the work has been focused over the last year since then. I will try to sort of go through all of the buckets of climate action, but will also appreciate that you may be more focused on the ag and forestry side, but do appreciate. Since you know, right? No hot coffee.
Before you.
Yeah, in a very graceful way. Go ahead.
I just had an organizational question.
Sure.
Is there a difference between the Ag and Ecosystems Subcommittee and the Payment for Ecosystem Services and Soil Health? Because like Zelig, Abby Course keeps showing up on all these, right?
Yeah, Abby's just one of those volunteers who gives way too much of her time, and we're grateful for it because she has a lot to offer. Yeah, so the Ag and Eco Subcommittee is a body that was written into the law of the Global Warming Solutions Act, and it's really thinking about policy recommendations at the highest level. And then I'm sure Abby and Ryan and others can fill in where I get this wrong, but in my mind, the Payment for Ecosystem Services, which aligns with a recommendation in the Climate Action Plan, is really that next step level of trying to take the recommendations, and it was already happening before the Climate Council and Climate Action Plan, but would actually try to design and implement the programs and recommendations. So it's all aligned and working in progress, but the Ag and Ecosystems Committee is really thinking about that higher level foundational work, and then hopefully they're moving forward through other state-led initiatives or private-led initiatives that bring those recommendations to real life and possibility in state government and elsewhere.
And there's similar ones then for the other system committees sort of out there too?
Yes, there are. Mm-hmm. Quite a few. And I'm more than happy to take questions along the way too, so thank you.
I'm just curious about this chart.
Yeah.
So specifically under electricity and agriculture, electricity, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Vermont generates only 30% of its electricity. Mm-hmm. So the 70% that we are not generating, is that being counted here?
Yes, so all of our electricity use from ISO New England and electricity use that's generated within state is represented here. What's not represented in the electricity sector here, reflects our gross emissions. And the way that the ledger is done for electricity and land use is a little is different. So biomass electricity, we do not count biogenic emissions in our gross inventory. So that is in our GHG inventory in the back. It's explained how much emissions come from burning of wood for electricity or from thermal applications. But we actually are in line with the majority of states. I would have said all 50 states, but one state has changed course as of late. Maine actually by statute is now actually counting biogenic emissions in their gross emissions inventory, but we don't. So electricity would be higher if you were showing biogenic emissions, but actually of all the wood burning is roughly 2 million metric tons a year of emissions. Our overall inventory is 8 million metric tons. I believe, and I should follow up if I get this wrong, but about 1.6 million metric tons of that is actually home heating, not electricity.
Oh.
Most of it comes from home heating, much more than actually the two plants.
So it wouldn't be grossly larger if we included those metrics.
Yeah, our overall emissions would be 10 million metric tons a year.
And then with agriculture, Vermont produces, I believe, 16% of its own food. Are you counting the other 84% of production in this metric?
It's a great question, and so we ag emissions, and this is something we're going to dive quite a bit deeper into today, is 16% of our overall emissions. This is all what's called an inbound inventory, so it does not account for food produced in other states. Those emissions are accounted by those states. The only thing that might show up here is transport through transportation fuels if they were purchased in Vermont to move those foods around. But yeah, no, it does not account for food. We are partnering right now with the Environmental Protection Agency to actually produce Vermont's first consumption-based inventory. So the estimates that are often thrown around by EPA for Vermont is that our inventory of what is inbound produced by Vermont is only about 20% of our footprint if you were to look at the consumption we take in from other states. So everything you order on Amazon or anything you buy and is shipped in, those emissions are not accounted here, they're accounted elsewhere, just like food and other things.
Representative Cole.
I'm wondering if you could speak a little more to the thermal section here because it is so enormous.
Yeah.
For transportation.
Yeah, so, and the preliminary data for 2020 shows it actually passing transportation for the first time. We think that's we're not sure if that's lasting because of the pandemic. Transportation dropped quite a bit for 2020. And then we expect it to rebound. But for 2020, it'll be the first year that thermal sector is bigger than transportation, actually. Transportation and thermal, it's that they sort of are in line with other states. Those are always the two largest sectors for states. What's different in Vermont is that our electricity sector, because we've seen such tremendous progress through the renewable energy standard, is quite clean. And so electricity is normally the third largest sector, but in our case, agriculture is at 16%. But we have a very rough way of the way we calculate our ag emissions, and we're working to refine that, which we'll talk about. But transportation in a rural state is a really challenging issue, right? Like we drive a lot to get where we're going. We use single vehicles. And then of course, home heating in a cold state is always going to be a challenge because the way we heat our homes. So what this shows on this graph, the data is most current on this through 2018. So obviously that's 5 years ago right now. We're in 2023. We're in the process of producing our greenhouse gas inventory for the years through 2020, and that will come out this first quarter of 2023 and catch us up. There's always about a 2.5 to 3 year lag time in being able to calculate our emissions because we rely on national models right now for both the land use sector and the thermal sector. So we are striving to have better data and more refined data that allows us to produce numbers and more in line with calendar year. But right now, the emissions inventory will always be roughly 2.5 to 3 years behind. And so what you see here in the shaded area is a projection. It is not what our actual emissions are. It's a projection of where we need to go based on the statutory requirements in the GWSA. So these are goals that were on the books for a long time. We weren't making progress like folks with the legislature and others wanted us to. And so these are now not choice, not goals anymore. They're statutory requirements. The 2025, you'll notice between 2025 and 2030, the line changes quite steeply. 2025 has a different baseline year that we're striving to cut our emissions against. So we're looking to cut our emissions 26% below 2005 levels. And again, 2005 was our biggest year for emissions. So an easier path to get to. But 2030, these are really challenging pollution reduction targets that we will not make without significant policy intervention. So they're hard.
Representative Cole?
Being statute as it is, what sort of consequences exist for not following these rules? Because they are referred to often as goals. So I'm just curious about the consequences.
Yeah, there's a cause of action language within the GWSA where ANR can be sued and has to respond through rulemaking. So right now, the Climate Action Plan takes I would argue a very incentive-based like a handoff to the legislature to say, these are our recommendations. We need you to act in partnership. There was only one suite of rules that were put forward in the Climate Action Plan in the transportation space. Those have been adopted by ANR. I'll mention those in a minute, but there is no other regulatory proposal right now that ANR is pushing or other agencies are pushing to meet these emission reduction requirements.
Thank you.
Representative Rice?
Yeah, that was mostly what my question was, but I was gonna go back to the previous slide and just ask sort of, because we've shifted from goals to set legal requirements, can you just speak a little bit to the difference between language when we say that the Climate Action Plan aims to cut pollution versus we are required to cut?
Yeah, maybe that's just the wrong actual word choice in the slide. I mean, we are required by the GWSA to put recommendations in the Climate Action Plan that add up to pollution reduction requirements of the GWSA. In order to support that for the initial Climate Action Plan, we worked closely with Cadmus and Energy Futures Group to do a pathways modeling report. I'm not sure actually if I sent this committee, but I'd be more than happy to follow up if I didn't send it to you, Chair. The Climate Council report from last year, which reports on the Climate Council's progress and technical analyses, but in it, there's a paragraph that speaks to the pathways analysis and has a link to that specific report. And it speaks to the modeling that was put forward to review the recommendations in this plan and see if it adds up, if they were all enacted. And the only area I will say where we don't have a policy right now in place to get us all the way is the transportation space, largely because the Climate Council looked towards joining TCIP, the Regional Transportation Program, to cut emissions, and that program's viability fell apart with Connecticut and Massachusetts pulling out a week before the Climate Action Plan was adopted, so there was no plan B. And so the transportation sector has seen significant movement because of the rules ANR put in place for clean cars, which I have a slide on, but it still falls short in meeting our short-term emission reduction requirements. And so there was a transportation addendum to the Climate Action Plan that the council adopted at the end of this year, signaling further work in the area. So briefly, I just want to say that the Global Warming Solutions Act has 7 main objectives. I think that the emissions reductions requirements get held up quite often as it's a law to cut our climate pollution. No matter how far we go with cutting our climate pollution in Vermont, and even if we meet these ambitious reduction requirements, which we're striving to do, our climate is changing, and our greatest asset is our natural and working lands, and thinking about how we invest in them for all the benefits that they provide, for both our working economy, for our working farmers, and for the resilience and adaptation that they provide around biodiversity and elsewhere. And so the objectives in the GWSA go farther to speak to how we should do that around sequestering and storing carbon and thinking about our rural communities and our natural and working lands. And I often think of this as a three-legged stool. We certainly need action in all of these areas, and in truest sense, acting to reduce emissions is really costly and challenging, and has many co-benefits. But the co-benefits of investing in our natural and working lands are countless, and really can be additive to the work we're already doing, like clean water work on our farms and elsewhere. And it's really understanding and quantifying those benefits in the coming years so that we don't ask new things of farmers and working landowners, but we can reinforce and focus in on the work that they're already doing and ensure that that value is there.
Representative O'Brien.
Are there any offsets to the requirements? Like if we, hit it out of the park on carbon storage and sequestration, would that count in some way towards the requirements on emissions reductions?
So yeah, I've failed to mention that, and I should have, that there's a net zero requirement in the law that doesn't come into account until 2050. And so that it's really important. We, as part of this work for the initial climate action plan, we did our first carbon budget, where we looked at a snapshot in time for how much carbon sequestration is happening across our natural and working lands. It was roughly 5 million metric tons currently. And so we need to ensure that that's there to even meet our net zero target. But yes, I suspect over time, as we think about the impacts and costs of cutting our emissions, I wonder and think if we'll be looking at sort of really a net zero and 2050 goals as really the most critical long-term for us, yeah. But right now, there is no legal binding way to do that, I just want to say. And so I'm going to run through these two slides about the recommendations in the plan quickly, because I know that Billy and others will go into them in a deep dive, but and I know you probably have seen this, the alarming trend that we are losing our agricultural lands at a alarming rate, as well as losing our forest land. And I think that many of the recommendations and the thoughts that Ag and Eco really put into this was, how do we not only reverse this trend, but ensure that the values and the attributes on these lands are there, and that we can use them and think about the benefits that they provide for climate change mitigation. So the bucket of recommendations that the Climate Council adopted via the Agricultural and Ecosystem Subcommittee really looked at many of the ideas and things that I imagine your committee has considered over the years. Really thinking about how you expand nature-based solutions. So ideas like the payment for ecosystem services was a recommendation in the climate action plan. It went farther to think about how can we roll out and take the good work in the agricultural space and try to translate that to forest working landowners. And I know that there is some movement on that front right now through the Vermont Council on Rural Development and others. It's thinking about strategic conservation, promoting healthy and connected river corridors, buffers, many of the solutions that we put on the ground to implement clean water practices, being able to quantify and double down on those where they have greenhouse gas mitigation benefits. And then, of course, with carbon storage, the legislature was successful in moving forward with the reserve land program and current use last year. That was a recommendation out of the subcommittee, as well as thinking about and understanding the role of carbon markets in the future and payment for ecosystem services, like I suggested, on forest land. So briefly, before I turn it over to Billy to talk more about the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee quickly, I do just want to highlight that since the Climate Action Office was stood up and working closely with our partners in Ag Agency and elsewhere, we've been really successful at actually moving forward quite a number of recommendations in the Climate Action Plan, as well as thinking about other supporting state government processes that are needed to really see forward the transition put forward and recommended through the Climate Action Plan. So I have been alluding to the rulemaking process. Vermont has been taken part in California Clean Car Standards since their inception, so more than 25 years now. You either have the way of going with federal car standards or through the Clean Air Act can follow suit with California. We were able to build upon rules that we already had in place to support clean cars and emission standards that now go further. And they look at a percentage of electric vehicles being delivered to Vermont and that percentage increasing over the next number of years until the phase out of internal combustion engine vehicles in 2035 for all passenger car vehicles and light duty trucks. That does not mean that you won't be able to buy an internal combustion engine vehicle. There'll still be a robust used market for years past then, but all new vehicles, and that ramp up really begins in 2026 when the model year 2026, when these rules go into effect. But that percent electric vehicles being delivered to Vermont were already part of our Advanced Clean Cars 1. Now building upon it, we've just sort of committed to going farther and carrying that through to 2035. And so that is a really strong commitment from Vermont to invest in electric vehicles. That requirement is not on you, the consumer. It's on OEMs to deliver electric vehicles. So it's incumbent on our state to support those OEMs to make sure they're put in placement so that we have robust incentives, EV infrastructure. We give people the confidence to buy an EV and make sure that they're affordable. By increasing the percent of electric vehicles delivered to Vermont, we also hope and expect that we'll transition to a robust electric used market because most Vermonters buy used cars, most Vermonters don't buy new vehicles. And that affordability issue is really real with electric vehicles. And so we're hopeful that these rules will have a really impactful transition on Vermont, and they come at a good time when we have robust federal funds to hopefully help build out the infrastructure needed to support this transition. And we also adopted a new rule as part of this package, Advanced Clean Trucks, which looks at an increasing number of electric vehicles in the medium and heavy duty fleet with not a complete phase out, knowing that the technology is not there yet for 100% electric vehicles to be delivered there. So this will help us meet more than 1/3 of the emission reduction requirements from the transportation sector between now and 2030. So these are really impactful rules. And if you look to the 2050 requirements, they likely will get us all the way because come 2035, vehicles turn over roughly every decade in Vermont. And so by 2045, you could envision all electric vehicles in Vermont as part of our main fleet. And so Vermont actually moved really quickly to adopt these rules and adopted them a week before California actually did and had to wait for California because we can't adopt before California does. So this was a really robust process that ANR undertook. And again, the only regulatory tool put forward in the Climate Action Plan. There was an addendum to the Climate Action Plan adopted this year in the transportation sector. It really just signals reinforcement of analyses needed to think about a sector-wide approach for transportation, thinking about the idea of a cap and invest or performance standard, but signaling to VTrans's study, which they're currently doing as required by receiving funds from IIJA, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill. They received a pot of money called the Carbon Reduction Funds and must study and review policies in this space. And so that will be done this coming summer for us to have better analysis in the transportation space. And I'll just highlight that really a coordinated vision to think not about sector by sector, but how we're going to cut climate pollution that meets and the most cost-effective way and administratively easiest way, because all of these policies and programs are really burdensome in small states. So we're really thinking about how can we analyze and think about where we need to make these pollution cuts and do them in a responsible way with Vermont-based data, as well as regional cooperation. And so we're moving forward with analyses, a priority for 2023 in both the buildings and thermal sector to better understand the questions that the governor put forward in his veto of the clean heat standard last year to inform new policy in that area, as well as coordinating really closely with VTrans on the transportation space and looking at how we can realize efficiencies by looking at policies across both of those sectors together. Yeah.
Representative, yeah, go ahead.
Quick question. What does Vermont-based data mean?
So the models and projections that you saw in that greenhouse gas inventory, for the transportation sector, we actually have Vermont-based fuel sales data that we get from DMV on a monthly basis. That's a holdover from an MOU we have with DMV from when we were looking at joining TCIP. But for the buildings and thermal sector, we do not have real data that is coming to us from the fuel. We use a model that the EPA puts forward in their SIP module for us to analyze and draw down comparisons for Vermont. So our hope is to be able to harmonize and look at reporting across fuel sectors and be able to get better real-time data on fuel sector.
Interesting.
So I'll start moving a little more quickly, appreciating others have testimony too. So happy to answer questions though. In the resilience and adaptation space, one of the requirements of the Global Warming Solutions Act was the development of a climate municipal toolkit. So working really closely, we've stood up a task group from the Climate Council that is comprised of select board members, scientists, RPC members, and others to first review what toolkits and capacity needs look like at the municipal level to implement climate action. And then really have stakeholder groups and conversations with municipalities to say, what capacity needs, what are your constraints, how can we help break those barriers, and then bring resources and tools to actually see action happening at municipal levels. And that's something that we hope to roll out this spring. And then think about future resources needed at RPCs and elsewhere to actually provide that technical assistance to municipalities and leverage through grant funding and elsewhere to drive climate action at the town level. I alluded to the lack of sort of measurability in this space, but this is something that we really want to ensure that resilience and adaptation is on that same level as cutting climate pollution. And so we're thinking about what are the metrics needed and to ensure that we're driving the right programs and solutions on the ground and able to quantify that and demonstrate the return that we're getting through the programs and work that we're doing. Some of the work that we're doing in that space is to develop tools such as the Municipal Vulnerability Index tool, which is a mapping tool that actually looks at social and hazard vulnerabilities and tries to overlay that so that towns and then state funders and RPCs have the resources they need to make priority decisions on the ground to direct resources. And the same analysis that we actually did to look at cutting climate pollution, we're also trying to make an economic analysis to actually drive investment in resilience and adaptation strategies, where like the cost of replacing that culvert and having a right-sized culvert on a stream is so much more beneficial than the cost you would have to pay to recover the flood damages later when that undersized culvert bursts. And so we're trying to create a narrative and a story that actually demonstrates the economic benefits to invest in those kinds of infrastructure changes as well as community tools so that those are on equal par with cutting climate pollution. In our natural and working lands, we, as I already mentioned, developed a carbon budget for the climate action plan. It was the first one that looked at agricultural lands and forest lands in Vermont. There were challenges and details with how well it did, but it's something that we're hoping to build upon the scientific understanding in that space and recreate it on a periodic timetable so that we can have that check and balance of how we're doing with our sequestration and storage. There is ongoing work in the biomass space. This past year, there was a significant effort to develop recommendations to be adopted and included in the climate action plan that think about biomass specifically for electricity. Because of changeover in the council at the end of the year, the council has not had the time to deliberate on them yet. But these were actually recommendations that came from the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee, and the council a year ago chose not to include them in the climate plan, largely because they weren't cross-pollinated with the mitigation folks. And so we've had a really robust task group that looks at just transitions, equity issues, science and data, ag, land issues, forest issues, to really put forward a really robust set of recommendations now. And I'm hopeful that the council will be able to deliberate on them in short term. An ongoing struggle is the way we account for agriculture in the inventory. It's a really gross tool in all senses. We're looking at gross emissions only, but it's really coarse in that it really just looks at acres and cows and doesn't really look at all of those co-benefits of the practices and the emissions that you get by doing cover crops, by different tillage practices. And so I know that Ryan will go into more detail on this, but this is something we've been working really closely to get funding from the U.S. Climate Alliance and to drive an RFP and analysis in the coming months with a partner who actually develops the module that's used by states, ICF, to actually have a contract in place to review data, review the tool, and understand if it's the best path forward for us in Vermont, and try to have refinements in the coming years. And finally, in the natural and working land space, I'll just say that we're collaborating with other states to think about what a net zero framework looks like. So how do we make sure that we're all accounting for the sequestration, the storage, the benefits that they provide in a similar way so that accounting can be consistent across states? And then what are the strategies and recommendations to build off of that and develop a net zero framework for the Northeast? And so that's something that we're really excited to be partnering with Maine and Massachusetts on, and something that I think will inform future iterations of the climate action plan. Measuring and tracking progress. I think I've hit on all of this except for 2 points. I will say that we are also currently doing a life cycle analysis for our energy use right now. That was a requirement of the Global Warming Solutions Act to think about the overall impact of energy use outside of the state, so that when we make choices to burn natural gas that's cleaner at the point of combustion, we understand the impacts of the extraction had outside of the state and the full sort of cradle to grave emissions of natural gas. The same with our electricity use around hydro. There are a lot of questions about Hydro-Quebec and the impacts of those ponds and the methane gas. So we can have real hard numbers that inform policy decisions about where we choose to direct our energy use going forward. That's something that will be done by the end of the spring. And then finally, we're working really closely again to think about the same thing with agriculture. And what the point I had meant to make, or not to build off agriculture, but just to say that measuring and tracking progress tool is something we'll be working on in what I feel like over the next 18 months to 3 years. It will be a big part of what we're doing and will require robust engagement with many of the stakeholders around this table. So just to close, the final piece of work that we've really been focused on and continue to build upon and are open to feedback on and constructive, because we know we're not there yet, is really thinking about how we engage with Vermonters in all of this work. The requirements of the Global Warming Solutions Act focus largely public engagement around rulemaking, which I would argue is a shortcoming of the law. It really obligates us to do deep engagement when we're already on a path to adopt rules that were required by the Climate Action Plan. It feels like we should be engaging with people way earlier in that process. We strive to do that with the first climate action plan, but of course, the tight timeline made it hard to meet those objectives. And so we continue to think about how we do better in this space. For the rulemaking, we acknowledged that this is a really significant transition to electrifying our fleet. And we tried to carry a message of what the programs that currently exist to support this transition and ask Vermonters what else is needed for them to feel successful going forward. What I would say we're still struggling with and lacking with is how to demonstrate that we're being responsive. If you want to co-create policy and ideas and recommendations with Vermonters, you need to be able to demonstrate in real time how you're responding and adapting to what you're hearing from the public. And that's something we're thinking a lot about how to do better with the Climate Council and then also in state government work. This coming year, the renewable energy policy, the Public Service Department is thinking a lot about changes to the renewable energy policy and renewable energy programs in the state. And the Climate Action Office will be thinking a lot with them about how to engage a robust voice of Vermonters in that process to inform what we hope will be policy development next legislative session. And all of our contracts, I should say, really are robust with stakeholder engagement as well as engagement through community liaisons and others to really try to reach Vermonters and have them participate in the development of these tools and be responsive to how they'll be most useful to them. So just in closing, we've worked really closely with state government to think about messaging and priorities for 2023. And I'll just leave you with an appreciation that in the resilience space and natural and working land space, it's really an appreciation that climate action really requires us to be thinking about all three legs of that stool: how to build resilience, how to enhance and foster sequestration, and how to cut our climate pollution. And we in state government will continue to sort of pound the drum that it's really about climate change is here, and we need to think about how to be responsive to that with community development and elsewhere, and understand that cutting climate pollution is a moral and statutory responsibility. But if we're to be successful in bringing Vermonters along, we need to be acting in all of these areas. So the focus over the coming years will really be about how to realize those benefits in our natural and working lands and with Vermonters as part of the solution with us. So that was a lot. Happy to answer any questions and know that many more will come up as folks dive deeper with you.
Yeah, let's start with Representative Graham.
So my question is, has there been any studying or plans to do any studying on how we're going to raise the income of the average Vermonter to be able to afford this? In other words, you can incentivize purchase of a car, but then you got to pay for the power to charge it, which the rates will more than likely go up. You may put a general repair garage out of business because they won't be able to fix these cars. So then you have to pay more for maintenance and repairs on these vehicles. And these vehicles are not being built in the state of Vermont, so we're not creating high-paying jobs to build these things. So is there a companion plan on how we're going to raise the income of the average Vermonter to be able to afford the long-term cost of these cars, vehicles?
Well, there's no companion plan, but I would just point out that these rules are not mandates or requirements on you, a Vermont consumer, to buy these cars. They're a requirement on the OEM, and they really codify a transition that's already happening in the manufacturing space around electric vehicles. Many people will say that when these rules first were put in place, they were designed to be technology driving. That is not the case anymore with Advanced Clean Cars 2. All of our analyses around them really are done in hand with car manufacturers, and they're really a reflection and codification of commitments that car manufacturers are already doing. So I fully appreciate that electric vehicles, the upfront cost is much more right now than an internal combustion engine vehicle. But the fact is, all of the analysis we did for this rulemaking, the long-term ownership is just much less. And I'd be happy to share the economic analysis that we did for the rulemaking process, but also appreciate that the infrastructure, the transition and impact to fuel dealers, to gasoline stations. There needs to be a plan that thinks about how we're bringing Vermonters along, not just the consumer, but the resources and economy that we rely on for that. And that is something that is being talked about a lot at the state level, but I can't point to any one plan in particular.
Well, it'd be certainly nice that there's a plan to carry Vermonters through this thing rather than just being, and you could say there's no requirement to buy them, but in 2050, you're not gonna have a lot of choice. Or 2060, you're not gonna have a lot of choice. It's either electric car or a horse.
They go a lot faster than a horse.
Representative Wilson.
Yeah, I want to thank you for all your work, but I represent my constituents that they have a lot of concerns about all this because it's very hard to understand. And there's a lot of people feel it's big government getting bigger, which costs too much money. Our carbon footprint in Vermont is less than 0.1%. A lot of people feel this is all getting forced because you have these requirements, you have to do this, you have to do that. You want to buy electric cars, which have probably very little chance of making it in Vermont. And a lot of people feel the Global Warming Solution Act in its inception was unconstitutional. Mm-hmm. And I don't think it is. And make this all affordable, it spells raising taxes in Vermont businesses. Outside big business probably does, but Vermont businesses and the Vermont people do not have more money for taxes for anything. So I'm sorry.
Yeah, I very much appreciate that. That is why we in state government at least put forward the message that it really requires us to think across the board on climate action and think about programs and responsibilities outside of just cutting climate pollution that really do resonate with Vermonters, investing in our natural and working lands and thinking about programs that we're already doing in that space. I will say that, the fortunate, maybe it's just offsetting the problem to a federal level and outside of our state, but we have been very fortunate over the last few years with the investments through ARPA and IIJA that we have been able to commit a significant amount of those funds to invest in programs like weatherization and affordable, cost-effective climate pollution measures that will support us in the long run of meeting our emissions reductions, not increasing taxes.
Representative Levitt, and then I want to have a quick time check, but go ahead.
Just a really quick question. What are the consequences if we don't meet any of these deadlines or these metrics?
Yeah.
So as I know we're behind already.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're not, we're on path to meet our 2025 reduction requirements, but not on trajectory without intervention to meet 2030. But it would require, once we had the inventory, the way the cause of action works, past missing the deadline, people can bring suit, and A&R would have to implement rules to meet the emissions reduction requirements, which would obviously be a much more blunt tool than actually working through legislation and elsewhere.
Great. So, well, I'm sure that we all have a lot more questions, but looking at the clock and knowing that although we scheduled this time through 2:30, we do have, the committee does have more time. We have 3 o'clock as our next floor session. if we took, I don't know, 5 minutes just to stretch, maybe that would be good. And then who is going to be up next?
I'll be next. I'll try to be super brief. I just had a little bit more detail
Well-
than Brian and Abby.
Okay, all right. Does that seem to work in the time that we've got?
Yes, I'm
Okay,
free.
we can always, we're always happy to have you come back, but since you've made the effort to get here today, we want to hear from you if we can. Great, all right, well, let's take a couple minutes. Oh, yes, Abby.
Sorry, Chair Durfee. I have to go retrieve a child at 2:45, so I will have to duck out at that juncture.
Well, then we'll make sure that, that we arrange things so that you have a chance to say something before then.
Sure, or, I can always come back. It's fine.
Okay.
We'll make it work.
Very good. Thank you for the heads up.
Probably only get about 10 minutes with you.
So let's just make this 5 minutes then.
Yeah.
Well, I'm available right across the street, so you can call me at any time and dig into whatever detail you.
I'm so curious as to why American for agriculture are at 16% for Vermont when the United Nations report was
Oh my God, yeah. I wouldn't say, I let my friend borrow this.
5% increase in forest.
Live.
So, which is a huge contributor to that number. Why are we so high in that stuff?
It was great that you brought up that point about raising taxes.
State of Vermont uses the FBA state inventory tool. They utilize the agricultural chapter, which accounts for emissions within the state.
I was just appreciating that you brought up that point about raising taxes and affordability.